Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 6. He forgot Paul Riesling in an afternoon of not unagreeable details. After a return to his office, which seemed to have staggered on without him, he drove a prospect out to view a four-flat tenement in the Linton district. He was inspired by the customer's admiration of the new cigar lighter. Thrice its novelty made him use it, and thrice he hurled half-smoked cigarettes from the car, protesting, "I got to quit smoking so blame much." Their ample discussion of every detail of the cigar lighter led them to speak of electric flat-irons and bed-warmers. Babbitt apologized for being so shabbily old-fashioned as still to use a hot water bottle, and he announced that he would have the sleeping porch wired at once. He had enormous and poetic admiration, though very little understanding, of all mechanical devices. They were his symbols of truth and beauty. Regarding each new intricate mechanism, metal lathe, two-jet carburetor, machine gun, oxyacetylene welder, he learned one good realistic-sounding phrase, and used it over and over with a delightful feeling of being technical and initiated. The customer joined him in the worship of machinery, and they came buoyantly up to the tenement and began that examination of plastic slate roof, calamine doors, and 7/8-inch blind-nailed flooring. Began those diplomacies of hurt surprise and readiness to be persuaded to do something they had already decided to do, which would some day result in a sale. On the way back, Babbitt picked up his partner and father-in-law, Henry T. Thompson, at his kitchen cabinet works, and they drove through South Zenith, a high-colored, banging, exciting region, new factories of Valhalla tile with gigantic wire-glass windows, surly old red-brick factories stained with tar, high-perched water tanks, big red trucks like locomotives, and on a score of hectic side-tracks far-wandering freight cars from the New York Central and apple orchards, the Great Northern and wheat plateaus, the Southern Pacific and orange groves. They talked to the secretary of the Zenith Foundry Company about an interesting artistic project, a cast-iron fence for Linden Lane Cemetery. They drove on to the Zeeco Motor Company and interviewed the sales manager, Noel Ryland, about a discount on a Zeeco car for Thompson. Babbitt and Ryland were fellow members of the Boosters Club, and no booster felt right if he bought anything from another booster without receiving a discount. But Henry Thompson growled, "Oh, to hell with them! I'm not going to crawl around mooching discounts, not from nobody." It was one of the differences between Thompson, the old-fashioned, lean Yankee, rugged, traditional stage type of American business man, and Babbitt, the plump, smooth, efficient, up-to-the-minute, and otherwise perfected modern. Whenever Thompson twanged, "Put your John Hancock on that line," Babbitt was as much amused by the antiquated provincialism as any proper Englishman by any American. He knew himself to be of a breeding altogether more aesthetic and sensitive than Thompson's. He was a college graduate. He played golf. He often smoked cigarettes instead of cigars, and when he went to Chicago he took a room with a private bath. "The whole thing is," he explained to Paul Riesling, "these old codgers lack the subtlety that you have today." This advance in civilization could be carried too far, Babbitt perceived. Noel Ryland, sales manager of the Zeeco, was a frivolous graduate of Princeton, while Babbitt was a sound and standard wearer from the great department store, the State University. Ryland wore spats. He wrote long letters about city planning and community singing, and though he was a booster, he was known to carry in his pocket small volumes of poetry in a foreign language. All this was going too far. Henry Thompson was the extreme of insularity, and Noel Ryland the extreme of frothiness, while between them, supporting the state, defending the evangelical churches, and domestic brightness and sound business, were Babbitt and his friends. With this just estimate of himself, and with the promise of a discount on Thompson's car, he returned to his office in triumph. But as he went through the corridor of the Reeves Building he sighed, "Poor old Paul. I got to Oh, damn Noel Ryland, damn Charlie McKelvey. Just because they make more money than I do, they think they're so superior. I wouldn't be found dead in their stuffy old union club. Somehow, today, I don't feel like going back to work. Oh, well. 2. He answered telephone calls. He read the 4 o'clock mail. He signed his morning's letters. He talked to a tenant about repairs. He fought with Stanley Graff. Young Graff, the outside salesman, was always hinting that he deserved an increase of commission, and today he complained, "I think I ought to get a bonus if I put through the Healer sale. I'm chasing around and working on it every single evening, almost." Babbitt frequently remarked to his wife that it was better to con your office help along and keep 'em happy, instead of jumping on 'em and poking 'em up. Get more work out of 'em that way. But this unexampled lack of appreciation hurt him, and he turned on Graff. "Look here, Stan, let's get this clear. You've got an idea somehow that it's you that do all the selling. Where'd you get that stuff? Where'd you think you'd be if it wasn't for our capital behind you, and our lists of properties, and all the prospects we find for you? All you got to do is follow up our tips and close the deal. The hall porter could sell Babbitt Thompson listings. You say you're engaged to a girl, but have to put in your evenings chasing for buyers. Well, why the devil shouldn't you? What do you want to do? Sit around holding her hand? Let me tell you, Stan, if your girl is worth her salt, she'll be glad to know you're out hustling, making some money to furnish the home nest instead of doing the lovey-dovey. The kind of fellow that kicks about working overtime, that wants to spend his evenings reading trashy novels or spooning and exchanging a lot of nonsense and foolishness with some girl, he ain't the kind of upstanding, energetic young man with a future and with vision that we want here. How about it? What's your ideal, anyway? Do you want to make money and be a responsible member of the community, or do you want to be a loafer with no inspiration or pep?" Graff was not so amiable to vision and ideals as usual. "You bet I want to make money. That's why I want that bonus. Honest, Mr. Babbitt, I don't want to get fresh, but this Heller house is a terror. Nobody'll fall for it. The flooring is rotten and the walls are full of cracks." "That's exactly what I mean. To a salesman with a love for his profession, it's hard problems like that that inspire him to do his best. Besides, Stan, matter of fact, Thompson and I are against bonuses as a matter of principle. We like you, and we want to help you so you can get married, but we can't be unfair to the others on the staff. If we start giving you bonuses, don't you see we're going to hurt the feelings and be unjust to Penniman and Laylock? Right's right, and discrimination is unfair, and there ain't going to be any of it in this office. Don't get the idea, Stan, that because during the war salesmen were hard to hire, now when there's a lot of men out of work, there aren't a slew of bright young fellows that would be glad to step in and enjoy your opportunities and not act as if Thompson and I were his enemies and not do any work except for bonuses. How about it, eh? How about it?" "Oh, well, gee, of course," sighed Graff as he went out crabwise. Babbitt did not often squabble with his employees. He liked to like the people about him. He was dismayed when they did not like him. It was only when they attacked the sacred purse that he was frightened into a fury. But then, being a man given to oratory and high principles, he enjoyed the sound of his own vocabulary and the warmth of his own virtue. Today he had so passionately indulged in self-approval that he wondered whether he had been entirely just. "After all, Stan isn't a boy any more. Oughtn't to call him so hard. But rats, got to haul folks over the coals now and then for their own good. Unpleasant duty, but I wonder if Stan is sore. She's saying to McGowan out there." So chill a wind of hatred blew from the outer office that the normal comfort of his evening home-going was ruined. He was distressed by losing that approval of his employees to which an executive is always slave. Ordinarily he left the office with 1,000 enjoyable fussy directions to the effect that there would undoubtedly be important tasks tomorrow, and Miss McGowan and Miss Bannigan would do well to be there early, and for heaven's sake remind him to call up Cornell Lyte soon as he came in. Tonight he departed with feigned and apologetic liveliness. He was as afraid of his still-faced clerks, of the eyes focused on him, Miss McGowan staring with head lifted from her typing, Miss Bannigan looking over her ledger, Matt Penniman craning around at his desk in the dark alcove, Stanley Graff sullenly expressionless as a parvenu before the bleak promontory of his butler. He hated to expose his back to their laughter, and in his efforts to be casually merry he stammered and was raucously friendly and oozed wretchedly out the door. But he forgot his misery when he saw from Smith Street the charms of Floral Heights, the roofs of red tile and green slate, the shining new sun parlors, and the stainless walls. 3. He stopped to inform Howard Littlefield, his scholarly neighbor, that though the day had been springlike, the evening might be cold. He went in to shout, "Where are you?" at his wife, with no very definite desire to know where she was. He examined the lawn to see whether the furnace man had raked it properly. With some satisfaction and a good deal of discussion of the matter with Mrs. Babbitt, Ted, and Howard Littlefield, he concluded that the furnace man had not raked it properly. He cut 2 tufts of wild grass with his wife's largest dressmaking scissors. He informed Ted that it was all nonsense having a furnace man. "Big husky fellow like you ought to do all the work around the house." And privately he meditated that it was agreeable to have it known throughout the neighborhood that he was so prosperous that his son never worked around the house. He stood on the sleeping porch and did his day's exercises, arms out sideways for 2 minutes, up for 2 minutes, while he muttered, "Oughta take more exercise, keep in shape," then went in to see whether his collar needed changing before dinner. As usual, it apparently did not. The Lettish Croat maid, a powerful woman, beat the dinner gong. The roast beef, roasted potatoes, and string beans were excellent this evening, and after an adequate sketch of the day's progressive weather states, his $450 fee, his lunch with Paul Riesling, and the proven merits of the new cigar lighter, he was moved to a benign, "Sort of thinking about buying a new car. Don't believe we'll get one till next year, but still we might." Verona, the older daughter, cried, "Oh, Dad, if you do, why don't you get a sedan? That would be perfectly slick. A closed car is so much more comfy than an open one."
"Well, now, I don't know about that. I kind of like an open car. You get more fresh air that way."
"Oh, shoot. Just because you've never tried a sedan. Let's get one. It's got a lot more class," said Ted. "A closed car does keep the clothes nicer," from Mrs. Babbitt. "You don't get your hair all blown to pieces," from Verona. "It's a lot sportier," from Ted. And from Tinka the youngest, "Oh, let's have a sedan. Mary Ellen's father has got one." Ted wound up, "Oh, everybody's got a closed car now, except us." Babbitt faced them.
"I guess you got nothing very terrible to complain about, anyway. I don't keep a car just to enable you children to look like millionaires, and I like an open car, so you can put the top down on summer evenings and go out for a drive and get some good fresh air. Besides, closed car costs more money."
Gee whiz, if the Delapadors can afford a closed car, I guess we can," prodded Ted.
"Huh. I make $8,000 a year to his 7, but I don't blow it all in and waste it and throw it around the way he does. Don't believe in this business of going and spending a whole lot of money to show off and—"
They went with ardor and some thoroughness into the matters of streamlined bodies, hill-climbing power, wire wheels, chrome steel, ignition systems, and body colors. It was much more than a study of transportation. It was an aspiration for knightly rank. In the city of Zenith, in the barbarous 20th century, A family motor indicated its social rank as precisely as the grades of the prairies determined the rank of an English family. Indeed, more precisely. Considering the opinion of old country families upon newly created brewery barons and woolen mill viscounts, the details of precedence were never officially determined. There was no court to decide whether the second son of a Pierce Arrow limousine should go for dinner before the first son of a Buick Roadster. But of the respective social importance there was no doubt, and where Babbitt as a boy had aspired to the presidency, his son aspired to a Packard Twin Six and an established position in the motor gentry. The favor which Babbitt had won from his family by speaking of a new car evaporated as they realized he didn't intend to buy one this year. Ted lamented, "Oh, Punk, the old boat looks as if it had fleas and been scratching its varnish off." Mrs. Babbitt said abstractedly, "It's no way to talk to your father." Babbitt raged, "If you're too much of a high-class gentleman and you belong to the Bon Ton and so on, why, you needn't take the car out this evening." Ted explained, I didn't mean," and dinner dragged on with normal domestic delight to the inevitable point at which Babbitt protested, Come now, we can't sit here all evening. Give the girl a chance to clear away the table." He was fretting, "What a family! I don't know how we all get to scrapping this way. Like to go off some place and be able to hear myself think. Paul, Maine, wear old pants and loaf and cuss." He said cautiously to his wife, "I've been in correspondence with a man in New York. Wants me to see him about a real estate trade. May not come off till summer. Hope it doesn't break just when we and the Riesling get together to go to Maine. Be a shame if we couldn't make the trip there together. Well, no use worrying now." Verona escaped immediately after dinner, with no discussion save an automatic, "Why don't you ever stay home?" from Babbitt. In the living room in a corner of the Davenport, Ted settled down to his home study, plain geometry, Cicero, and the agonizing metaphors of Comus. "I don't see why they give us this old-fashioned junk by Milton and Shakespeare and Wordsworth and all these has-beens," he protested. "Oh, I guess I could stand to see a show by Shakespeare if they had swell scenery and put on a lot of dog, but to sit down in cold blood and read 'em! These teachers, how do they get that way?" Mrs. Babbitt, darning socks, speculated, "Yes, I wonder why. Of course I don't want to fly in the face of the professors and everybody, but I do think there's things in Shakespeare. Not that I read him much, but when I was young the girls used to show me passages that weren't at all nice." Babbitt looked up irritably from the comic strips in the Evening Advocate. They composed his favorite literature and art, these illustrated chronicles in which Mr. Mutt hit Mr. Jeff with a rotten egg, and Mother corrected Father's vulgarisms by means of a rolling pin. With the solemn face of a devotee breathing heavily through his open mouth, he plodded nightly through every picture, and during the rite he detested interruptions. Furthermore, he felt that on the subject of Shakespeare he wasn't really an authority. Neither the Advocate-Times, the Evening Advocate, nor the Bulletin of the Zenith Chamber of Commerce had ever had an editorial on the matter, and until one of them had spoken he found it hard to form an original opinion. But even at risk of floundering in strange bogs, he could not keep out of an open controversy. "I'll tell you why you have to study Shakespeare and those. It's because they're required for college entrance, and that's all there is to it. Personally, I don't see myself why they stuck 'em into an up-to-date high school system like we have here in this state. Be a good deal better if you took business English and learned how to write an ad, or letters that would pull. But there it is, and there's no tall argument or discussion about it. Trouble with you, Ted, is you always want to do something different. If you're going to law school, and you are, I never had a chance to, but I'll see that you do. Why, you'll want to lay in all the English and Latin you can get." "Oh, Punk, I don't see what's the use of law school, nor even finishing high school. I don't want to go to college, specially. Honest, there's a lot of fellows that have graduated from colleges that don't even begin to make as much money as the fellows that went to work early. Old Shimmy Peters, that teaches Latin in the high, he's a what is it from Columbia, and he sits up all night reading a lot of greasy books, and he's always spieling about the value of languages. And the poor soak doesn't even make but 1,800 a year, and no traveling salesman would think of working for that. I know what I'd like to do. I'd like to be an aviator, or own a corking big garage, or else a fellow was telling me about it yesterday. I'd like to be one of those fellows that the Standard Oil Company sends out to China, and you live in a compound, and you don't have to do any work, and you get to see the world, and pagodas, and the ocean, and everything. And then I could take up correspondence courses. That's real stuff. You don't have to recite to some frosty-faced old dame that's trying to show off to the principal, and you can study any subject you want to. Just listen to this. I clipped these ads of some swell courses." He snatched from the back of his geometry 100 advertisements of those home study courses which the energy and foresight of American commerce have contributed to the science of education. The first displayed the portrait of a young man with a pure brow, an iron jaw, silk socks, and hair like patent leather, standing with one hand in his trouser pocket and the other extended with chiding forefinger. He was bewitching an audience of men with gray beard, paunches, bald heads, and every other sign of wisdom and prosperity. Above the picture was an inspiring educational symbol. No antiquated lamp or torch or owl or Minerva, but a row of dollar signs. The text ran, "Power and Prosperity and Public Speaking. A Yarn Told at the Club." Who do you think I ran into the other evening at the De Luxe restaurant? Why, old Freddie Durkee, that used to be a dead or alive shipping clerk in my old place, Mr. Mouseman, we used to laughingly call the dear fellow. One time he was so timid he was plumb scared of the super, and never got credit for the dandy work he did. Him at the De Luxe, and if he wasn't ordering a Tony feed, with all the fixin' from celery to nuts, and instead of being embarrassed by the waiters like he used to be at the little dump where we lunched in old Lang Syne, he was bossing them around like he was a millionaire. I cautiously asked him what he was doing. Freddie laughed and said, "Say, old chum, I guess you're wondering what's come over me. You'll be glad to know I'm now an assistant super at the old shop, and right on high road to prosperity and domination. And I look forward with confidence to a 12-cylinder car, and the wife is making things hum in the best society, and the kiddies getting a first-class education. What we teach you: how to address your lodge, how to give toasts, how to tell dialect stories, how to propose to a lady, how to entertain banquets, how to make convincing selling talks, how to build a big vocabulary, how to create a strong personality, how to become a rational, powerful, and original thinker, how to be a master man." Prof. W. F. Peet, author of the Short-Cut Course in Public Speaking, is easily the foremost figure in practical literature, psychology, and oratory, a graduate of some of our leading universities, lecturer, extensive traveler, author of books, poetry, etc., a man with the unique personality of the master minds. He is ready to give you all the secrets of his culture and hammering force in a few easy lessons that will not interfere with other occupations. Here's how it happened. I ran across an ad of a course that claimed to teach people how to talk easily on their feet and to answer complaints, how to lay a proposition before the boss, how to hit a bank for a loan, how to hold a big audience spellbound with wit, humor, aniseed, inspiration, etc. It was compiled by the master orator, Professor Waldo F. Peet. I was skeptical, too, but I wrote, just on a postcard, with name and address, to the publisher for the lessons. Sent on trial. Money back if you're not absolutely satisfied. There were 8 simple lessons in plain language anybody could understand, and I studied them just a few hours a night, then started practicing on the wife. Soon found I could talk right up to the super, and get due credit for all the good work I did. they began to appreciate me and advance me fast, and say, "Old doggo, what do you think they're paying me now? $6,500 per year, and say, I find I can keep a big audience fascinated, speaking on any topic. As a friend, old boy, I advise you to send for circular, no obligation, and valuable free art picture to Shortcut Educational Publishing Company, Desk W.A., Sand Pit, Iowa. Are you a 100%er or a 10%er?" Babbitt was again without a canon which would enable him to speak with authority. Nothing in motoring or real estate had indicated what a solid citizen and regular fellow ought to think about culture by mail. He began with hesitation. "Well, sounds as if it covered the ground. Certainly is a fine thing to be able to orate. I sometimes thought I had a little talent that way myself. And I know darn well that one reason why a four-flushing old back number like Chan Mott can get away with it in real estate is just because he can make a good talk, even when he hasn't got a doggone thing to say. And it certainly is pretty cute the way they get out all those courses on various topics and subjects nowadays. I'll tell you, though, no need to blow a lot of good money on this stuff when you can get a first-rate course in eloquence and English and all that right now in your own school, and one of the biggest school buildings in the entire country." "That's so," said Mrs. Babbitt comfortably, while Ted complained, "Yeah, but Dad, they just teach a lot of old junk that isn't any practical use except the manual training and typewriting and basketball and dancing, and in these correspondence courses, gee, you can get all kinds of stuff that would come in handy. Say, listen to this one. Can you play a man's part? If you are walking with your mother, sister, or best girl, and someone passes a slighting remark or uses improper language, won't you be ashamed if you can't take her part? Well, can you? We teach boxing and self-defense by mail. Many pupils have written saying that after a few lessons they've outboxed bigger and heavier opponents. The lessons start with simple movements practiced before your mirror, holding out your hand for a coin, the breaststroke in swimming, etc. Before you realize it, you are striking scientifically, ducking, guarding, and feigning, just as if you had a real opponent before you. Oh, baby! Maybe I wouldn't like that, Ted chanted. I'll tell the world. Gosh, I'd like to take one fellow I know in school that's always shooting off his mouth and catch him alone. Nonsense! The idea! Most useless thing I ever heard of! Babbitt fulminated. Well, just suppose I was walking with Mama or Roan, and somebody passed a slighting remark or used improper language. What would I do? Why, you'd probably bust a record for the 100-yard dash. I would not. I'd stand right up to any mucker that passed a slighting remark on my sister, and I'd show him. Look here, young Dempsey, if I ever catch you fighting, I'll whale the everlasting daylights out of you, and I'll do it without practice and holding out my hand for a coin before a mirror, too. Why, Ted, dear, Mrs. Babbitt said placidly, it's not at all nice you're talking of fighting this way. Well, gosh almighty, that's a fine way to appreciate. And then suppose I was walking with you, Ma, and somebody passed a slighting remark. Nobody's going to pass no slighting remarks on nobody, Babbitt observed. Not if they stay home and study their geometry and mind their own affairs instead of hanging out around a lot of pool rooms and soda fountains and places where nobody got any business to be. But, gosh, Dad, if they did, Mrs. Babbitt chirped. Well, if they did, I wouldn't do them the honor of paying any attention to them. Besides, they never do. You always hear about these women that get followed and insulted and all, but I don't believe a word of it. Or it's their own fault, the way some women look at a person. I certainly never have been insulted by... Oh, shoot, Mother, just suppose you were sometime. Just suppose. Can't you suppose something? Can't you imagine things? Certainly I can imagine things. The idea. Certainly Mother can imagine things and suppose things. Think you're the only member of this household that's got imagination? Babbitt demanded.
But what's the use of a lot of supposing? Supposing never gets you anywhere. No sense supposing when there's a lot of real facts to take into consider.
Look here, Dad. Suppose, I mean, just suppose you were in your office and some rival real estate man,
Realtor.
some realtor you hated came in.
I don't hate any realtor.
But suppose you did.
I don't intend to suppose anything of the kind. There's plenty of fellows in my profession that stoop and hate their competitors. But if you were a little older and understood business, instead of always going on to the movies and running around with a lot of fool girls with their dresses up to their knees and powdered and painted and rouged and God knows what all, as if they were chorus girls, then you'd know, and you'd suppose that if there's any one thing I stand for in the real estate circles of Zenith, it is that we ought to always speak of each other only in the friendliest terms and institute a spirit of brotherhood and cooperation. And so I certainly can't suppose, and I can't imagine my hating any other realtor, not even that dirty four-flushing society sneak, Cecil Roundtree.
But,
And there's no if, and, or but about it. But if I were going to lambaste somebody, I wouldn't require any fancy ducks or swimming strokes before a mirror, or any of these doodads and flip-flops. Suppose you were out some place and a fellow called you vile names. Think you'd want to box and jump around like a dancing master? You'd just lay him out cold. Least I certainly hope any son of mine would. And then you'd dust off your hands and go on about your business. And that's all there is to it. And you aren't going to have any boxing lessons by mail either.
well, but yes, I just wanted to show how many different kinds of correspondence courses there are instead of all the cambric they teach us in the high.
But I thought they taught you boxing in the school gymnasium.
That's different. They stick you up and some big stiff amuses himself pounding the stuffings out of you before you have a chance to learn. Not any, but anyway, listen to some of these others.
The advertisements were truly philanthropic. One of them bore the rousing headline, Money, Money, Money. The second announced that Mr. P.R., formerly making only $18 a week in a barber shop, writes to us that since taking our course, he is now pulling down $5,000 as an osteovitalic physician. And the third that Miss J.L., recently a wrapper in a store, is now getting $10 real dollars a day, teaching our Hindu system of vibratory breathing and mental control. Ted had collected 50 or 60 announcements from annual reference books, from Sunday school periodicals, fiction magazines, and journals of discussion. One benefactor implored, "Don't be a wallflower. Be more popular and make more money. You can ukulele or sing yourself into society by the secret principles of a newly discovered system of music teaching. Anyone, man, lady, or child, can, without tiresome exercises, special training, or long drawn-out study, and without waste of time, money, or energy, learn to play by note piano, banjo, cornet, clarinet, saxophone, violin, or drum, and learn sight singing." The next, under the wistful appeal, "Fingerprint detectives wanted. Big incomes." Confided, "You, red-blooded men and women, this is the profession you have been looking for. There's money in it. Big money." And that rapid change of scene, that entrancing and compelling interest and fascination which your active mind and adventure spirit crave. Think of being the chief figure and directing factor in solving strange mysteries and baffling crimes. This wonderful profession brings you into contact with influential men on the basis of equality, and often calls upon you to travel everywhere, maybe to distant lands, all expenses paid, no special education required. Oh, boy, I guess that wins a fire-brick necklace. Wouldn't it be swell to travel everywhere and nab some famous crook? Whoop, Ted. Well, I don't think much of that. Doggone likely to get hurt. Still, that music study stunt might be pretty fair, though. There's no reason why, if efficiency experts put their minds to it the way they have to routing products in a factory, they couldn't figure out some scheme so a person wouldn't have to monkey with all this practicing and exercising that get in music. Babbitt was impressed, and he had a delightful parental feeling that they two, the men of the family, understood each other. He listened to the notices of mailbox universities which taught short story writing, improving the memory, motion picture acting, and developing the soul power, banking and Spanish, chiropody and photography.
electrical engineering and window trimming, poultry raising, and chemistry.
Well, well,
Babbitt sought for adequate expression of his admiration.
I'm a son of a gun. I know this correspondence school business had become a mighty profitable game. Makes suburban real estate look like 2 cents. But I didn't realize it had got to be such a key industry. Must rank right up there with groceries and movies. Always figured somebody'd come along with the brains not to leave education to a lot of bookworms and impractical theorists, but make a big thing out of it. Yes, I can see how a lot of those courses might interest you. I must ask the fellows at Athletics if they ever realized. But same time, Ted, you know how some advertisers exaggerate. I don't know as they'd be able to jam you through those courses as fast as they claim they can."
"Oh, sure, Dad, of course." Ted had the immense and joyful maturity of a boy who is respectfully listened to by his elders. Babbitt concentrated on him with grateful affection.
"I can see what an influence these courses might have on the whole educational works. Of course, I'd never admit it publicly. A fellow like myself, a State U graduate. It's only decent and patriotic for him to blow his horn and boost an alma mater. But smarter of fact, there's a whole lot of valuable time lost even at the U, studying poetry and French and subjects that never brought in anybody a cent. I don't know but what maybe these correspondence courses might prove to be one of the most important American inventions. Trouble with a lot of folks, they're so blame material, they don't see the spiritual and mental side of American supremacy. They think that inventions like the telephone and the airplane and wireless, no, that was a whop invention, but anyway, they think these mechanical improvements are all that we stand for, whereas to a real thinker, he sees that spiritual and dominating movements like efficiency and Rotarianism and prohibition and democracy are what compose our deepest and truest wealth. And maybe this new principle in education at home may be another factor. I'll tell you, Ted, we've got to have vision."
"I think those correspondence courses are terrible." The philosophers gasped. It was Mrs. Babbitt who had made this discord in their spiritual harmony. And one of Miss Babbitt's virtues was that, except during dinner parties, when she was transformed into a raging hostess, she took care of the house and didn't bother the males by thinking. She went on firmly, "It sounds awful to me, the way they coax these poor young folks to think they're learning something, and nobody round to help them, and you two learn so quick, but me, I always was slow, but just the same."
Babbitt attended to her. "Nonsense! Get just as much studying at home. You don't think a fellow learns any more because he blows in his father's hard-earned money and sits around in Morris chairs in a swell Harvard dormitory with pictures and shields and table covers and no doodads, do you? I tell you, I'm a college man, I know. There's one objection you might make, though. I certainly do protest against any effort to get a lot of fellows out of barber shops and factories into the professions. They're too crowded already. And what'll we do for workmen if all those fellows go and get educated?"
Ted was leaning back, smoking a cigarette without reproof. He was, for the moment, sharing the high, thin air of Babbitt's speculation as though he were a Paul Riesling or even Dr. Howard Littlefield. He hinted, "Well, what do you think, then, Dad? Wouldn't it be a good idea if I could go off to China or some peppy place and study engineering or something by mail?"
"No, and I'll tell you why, son. I've found out it's a mighty nice thing to be able to say you're a B.A. Some client that doesn't know what you are and thinks you're just a plug businessman, he gets to shooting off his mouth about economics or literature or foreign trade conditions, and you just ease in something like, 'When I was in college, of course I got my B.A. in sociology and all that junk.' Oh, it puts an awful crimp in their style. But there wouldn't be any class to saying, 'I got the degree of sticker licker from Benzos Mail Order University.' You see? My dad was a pretty good old coot, but he never had much style to him, and I had to work darn hard to earn my way through college. Well, it's been worth it, to be able to associate with the finest gentlemen in Zenith at the clubs and so on, and I wouldn't want you to drop out of the gentleman class, the class that are just as red-blooded as common people, but still have power and personality. It would kind of hurt me if you did that, old man."
"I know, Dad. Sure. All right. I'll stick to it," Say, gosh, gee whiz, I forgot all about those kids I was going to take to the chorus rehearsal. I'll have to duck."
"But you haven't done your homework."
"Do it first thing in the morning."
"Well—"
6 times in the past 60 days Babbitt had stormed,
"You will not do it first thing in the morning. You'll do it right now."
but tonight he said,
"Well, better hustle."
His smile was the rare shy radiance he kept for Paul Riesling. 4.
"Ted's a good boy,"
he said to Miss Babbitt. "Oh, he is."
"Who's these girls he's going to pick up? Are they nice, decent girls?"
"I don't know. Oh, dear, Ted never tells me anything any more. I don't understand what's come over the children of this generation. I used to have to tell Papa and Mama everything, but it seems like the children today have just slipped away from all control."
"I hope they're decent girls. Of course, Ted's no longer a kid, and I wouldn't want him to get mixed up in everything."
"George, I wonder if you hadn't ought to take him aside and tell him about things." She blushed and lowered her eyes.
"Well, I don't know. Way I figure it, Myra, no sense suggesting a lot of things to a boy's mind. Think up enough devilment by himself, but I wonder. It's kind of a hard question. Wonder what Littlefield thinks about it."
"Of course Papa agrees with you. He says all this instruction is, he says 'tisn't decent."
"Oh, he does he? Well, let me tell you that whatever Henry T. Thompson thinks about morals, I mean, though of course you can't beat the old duffer—"
"Why, what a way to talk of Papa!"
"Simply can't beat him at getting in on the ground floor of a deal. But let me tell you, whenever he springs any ideas about higher things and education, then I think just the opposite. You may not regard me as any great brain shark, but believe me, I'm a regular college president compared to Henry T. Yes, sir, by golly, I'm going to take Ted aside and tell him why I lead a strictly moral life."
"Oh, will you? When?"
When? What's the use of trying to pin me down to when and why and where and how and when? That's the trouble with women. That's why they don't make a high-class executives. They haven't any sense of diplomacy. When the proper opportunity and occasion arises, so it just comes in natural, why, then I'll have a friendly little talk with him and— Was that Tinka hollering upstairs? She ought to be asleep long ago."
He prowled through the living room and stood in the sun parlor, that glass-walled room of wicker chairs and swinging couch in which they loafed on Sunday afternoons. Outside, only the light of Doppelbrau's house and the dim presence of Babbitt's favorite elm broke the softness of April night.
"Good business with the boy. Getting over feeling cranky the way I did this morning, and restless. Though, by golly, I will have a few days alone with Paul in Maine, and that devil Zilla. But Ted's all right, whole family's all right, and good business. Not many fellows make $450, practically half of $1,000 easy as I did today. Maybe when we all get to rowing, it's just as much my fault as it is theirs. Oughtn't to get grouchy like I do, but wish I'd been a pioneer, same as my granddad. But then wouldn't have a house like this. Oh, gosh, I don't know."
He thought moodily of Paul Riesling, of their youth together, of the girls they had known. When Babbitt had graduated from the State University 24 years ago, he had intended to be a lawyer. He had been a ponderous debater in college. He felt that he was an orator. He saw himself becoming governor of the state. While he read law, he worked as a real estate salesman. He saved money, lived in a boarding house, supped on poached egg and hash. The lively Paul Riesling, who was going off to Europe to study violin next month or next year, was his refuge till Paul was bespelled by Zilla Colbeck, who laughed and danced and drew men after her plump and gaily wagging finger. Babbitt's evenings were barren then, and he found comfort only in Paul's second cousin, Myra Thompson, a sleek and gentle girl who showed her capacity by agreeing with the ardent young Babbitt that of course he was going to be governor some day. Where Zilla mocked him as a country boy, Myra said indignantly that he was ever so much soldier than the young dandies who had been born in the great city of Zenith, an ancient settlement in 1897, 105 years old, with 200,000 population. the queen and wonder of all the state, and to the Catawba boy, George Babbitt, so vast and thunderous and luxurious that he was flattered to know a girl ennobled by birth in Zenith. Of love there was no talk between them. He knew that if he was to study law he could not marry for years, and Myra was distinctly a nice girl. One didn't kiss her, one didn't think about her that way at all, unless one was going to marry her. But she was a dependable companion. She was always ready to go skating, walking, always content to hear his discourses on the great things he was going to do, the distressed poor whom he would defend against the unjust rich, the speeches he would make at banquets, the inexactitudes of popular thought which he would correct. One evening, when he was weary and soft-minded, he saw that she had been weeping. She had been left out of a party given by Zilla. Somehow her head was on his shoulder, and he was kissing away her tears, and she raised her head to say trustingly, "Now that we're engaged, shall we be married soon, or shall we wait?"
Engaged?
It was his first hint of it. His affection for his brown, tender woman went cold and fearful, but he could not hurt her, could not abuse her trust. He mumbled something about waiting and escaped. He walked for an hour, trying to find a way of telling her that it was a mistake. Often in the month after, he got near to telling her, but it was pleasant to have a girl in his arms, and less could he insult her by blurting out that he didn't love her. He himself had no doubt. The evening before his marriage was an agony, and the morning wild with the desire to flee. She made him what is known as a good wife. She was loyal, industrious, and at rare times merry. She passed from a feeble disgust at their closer relations into what promised to be an ardent affection, but it drooped into bored routine. Yet she existed only for him and for the children, and she was as sorry, as worried as himself when he gave up the law and trudged on in a rut of listing real estate.
Poor kid, she hasn't had much better time than I have, Babbitt reflected,
standing in the dark sun-parlor.
But I wish I could have had a whirl at law and politics, seen what I could do. Well, maybe I've made more money as it is.
He returned to the living room, but before he settled down, he smoothed his wife's hair. She glanced up, happy and somewhat surprised. End of Chapter 6. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 7. Part 1. He solemnly finished the last copy of the American Magazine while his wife sighed, laid away her darning, and looked enviously at the lingerie designs in a woman's magazine. The room was very still. It was a room which observed the best Floral Heights standards. The gray walls were divided into artificial paneling by strips of white enameled pine. From the Babbitts' former house had come two much carved rocking chairs, but the other chairs were new, very deep and restful, upholstered in blue and gold striped velvet. A blue velvet davenport faced the fireplace, and behind it was a cherry-wood table and a tall piano lamp with a shade of golden silk. 2 out of every 3 houses in Floral Heights had before the fireplace a davenport, a mahogany table, real or imitation, and a piano lamp or reading lamp with a shade of yellow or rose silk. On the table was a runner of gold-threaded Chinese fabric, 4 magazines, a silver box containing cigarette crumbs, and 3 gift books, large, expensive editions of fairy tales illustrated by English artists, and as yet unread by any Babbitt save Tinka. In a corner by the front windows was a large cabinet Victrola. 8 out of every 9 Floral Heights houses had a cabinet phonograph. Among the pictures, hung in the exact center of each gray panel, were a red and black imitation English hunting print, an anemic imitation boudoir print, with a French caption of whose morality Babbitt had always been rather suspicious, and a hand-colored photograph of a colonial room, rag rug, maiden spinning, cat demure before a white fireplace. 19 out of every 20 houses in Floral Heights had either a hunting print, a Madame Fage la Toilette print, a colored photograph of a New England house, a photograph of a Rocky Mountain, or all four. It was a room as superior in comfort to the parlor of Babbitt's boyhood as his motor was superior to his father's buggy. Though there was nothing in the room that was interesting, there was nothing that was offensive. It was as neat and as negative as a block of artificial ice. The fireplace was unsoftened by downy ashes or sooty brick. The brass fire-irons were of immaculate polish, and the grenadier andirons were like samples in a shop, desolate, unwanted, lifeless things of commerce. Against the wall was a piano, with another piano lamp, but no one used it save Tinka. The hard briskness of the phonograph contented them. Their store of jazz records made them feel wealthy and cultured, and all they knew of creating music was the nice adjustment of a bamboo needle. The books on the table were unspotted and laid in rigid parallels. Not one corner of the carpet rug was curled, and nowhere was there a hockey stick, a torn picture book, an old cap, or a gregarious and disorganizing dog. 2. At home, Babbitt never read with absorption. He was concentrated enough at the office, but here he crossed his legs and fidgeted. When his story was interesting, he read the best. That was the funniest paragraphs to his wife. When it did not hold him, he coughed, scratched his ankles and his right ear, thrust his left thumb into his vest pocket, jingled his silver, whirled the cigar-cutter and keys on one end of his watch-chain, yawned, rubbed his nose, and found errands to do. He went upstairs to put on his slippers, his elegant slippers of seal brown, shaped like medieval shoes. He brought up an apple from the barrel which stood by the trunk-closet in the basement. "Apple a day keeps the doctor away," he enlightened Mrs. Babbitt, for quite the first time in 14 hours. "That's so." "An apple is nature's best regulator." "Yes, it—" "Trouble with women is they never have sense enough to form regular habits." "Why?" "Always nibbling and eating between meals." "George!"
She looked up from her reading.
"Did you have a light lunch today, like you were going to? I did."
This malicious and unprovoked attack astounded him. "Well, maybe it wasn't light as went to lunch with Paul and didn't have much chance to diet." "Oh, you needn't grin like a Chessy cat. If it wasn't for me watching out and keeping an eye on our diet, I'm the only member of this family that appreciates the value of oatmeal for breakfast. She stooped over her story while he piously sliced and gulped down the apple, discoursing. "One thing I've done, cut down my smoking. Had kind of a run-in with Graff in the office. He's getting too darn fresh. I'll stand for a good deal, but once in a while I got to assert my authority, and I jumped him, Stan. I said, well, I told him just exactly where to get off. Funny kind of day. Makes me feel restless."
"Well, the sleepiest sound in the world, the terminal yawn." Mrs. Babbitt yawned with it, and looked graceful as he droned,
"How about going to bed, eh? Don't suppose Rone and Ted will be in till all hours. Yep, funny kind of day. Not terribly warm, but yet, gosh, I'd like someday I'm going to take a long motor trip."
"Yes, we'd enjoy that," she yawned.
He looked away from her as he realized that he did not wish to have her go with him. As he locked the doors and tried the windows, and set the heat regulator so that the furnace drafts would open automatically in the morning, he sighed a little heavily with the lonely feeling which perplexed and frightened him. So absent-minded was he that he could not remember which window catches he had inspected, and through the darkness, fumbling at unseen perilous chairs, he crept back to try them all over again. His feet were loud on the steps as he clumped up stairs at the end of his great and treacherous day of veiled rebellions. 3. Before breakfast he always reverted to upstate village boyhood, and shrank from the complex urban demands of shaving, bathing, deciding whether the current shirt was clean enough for another day. Whenever he stayed home in the evening, he went to bed early, and thriftily got ahead in those dismal duties. It was his luxurious custom to shave while sitting snugly in a tubful of hot water.
He may be viewed to-night as a plump, smooth, pink, baldish, podgy, good man, robbed of the importance of spectacles, squatting in breast-high water, scraping his lather-smeared cheeks with a safety-razor like a tiny lawn-mower, and with melancholy dignity clawing through the water to recover a slippery and active piece of soap. He was lulled to dreaming by the caressing warmth. The light fell on the inner surface of the tub in a pattern of delicate wrinkled lines which slipped with a green sparkle over the curving porcelain as the clear water trembled. Babbitt lazily watched it, noted that along the silhouette of his legs against the radiance on the bottom of the tub, the shadows of air bubbles clinging to the hairs were reproduced as strange jungle mosses. He patted the water, and reflected light capsized and leaped and volleyed. He was content and childish. He played. He shaved a swath down the calf of one plump leg. The drain pipe was dripping a dulcet and lively song. Drippity drip, dribble, drippity drip, drip. He was enchanted by it. He looked at the solid tub, the beautiful nickel tabs, the tiled walls of the room, and felt virtuous in the possession of this splendor. He roused himself and spoke gruffly to his bath things. "Come here. You've done enough fooling." He reproved the treacherous soap, and defied the scratchy nail-brush with, "Oh, you would you?" He soaped himself and rinsed himself, and austerely rubbed himself. He noted a hole in the Turkish towel, and meditatively thrust a finger through it, and marched back to the bedroom, a grave and unbending citizen. There was a moment of gorgeous abandon, a flash of melodrama such as he found in traffic driving, when he laid out a clean collar, discovered that it was frayed in front, and tore it up with magnificent ying sound. Most important of all was the preparation of his bed and the sleeping porch. It is not known whether he enjoyed his sleeping porch because of the fresh air or because it was the standard thing to have a sleeping porch. Just as he was an Elk, a Booster, and a member of the Chamber of Commerce, just as the priests of the Presbyterian Church determined his every religious belief, and the senators who controlled the Republican party decided in little smoky rooms in Washington what he should think about disarmament, tariff, and Germany, so did the large national advertisers fix the surface of his life, fixed what he believed to be individuality. These standard advertised wares, toothpaste, socks, tires, cameras, instantaneous hot water heaters, were his symbols and proofs of excellence. At first the signs, then the substitutes for joy and passion and wisdom. But none of these advertised tokens of financial and social success was more significant than a sleeping porch with a sun parlor below. The rites of preparing for bed were elaborate and unchanging. The blankets had to be tucked in at the foot of his cot. Also, the reason why the maid hadn't tucked in the blankets had to be discussed with Mrs. Babbitt. The rag rug was adjusted so that his bare feet would strike it when he arose in the morning. The alarm clock was wound, the hot water bottle was filled and placed precisely 2 feet from the bottom of the cot. These tremendous undertakings yielded to his determination. One by one they were announced to Mrs. Babbitt, and smashed through to accomplishment. At last his brow cleared, and in his "Good night" rang virile power. But there was yet need of courage. As he sank into sleep, just at the first exquisite relaxation, the Doppelbrau car came home. He bounced into wakefulness, lamenting, "Why the devil can't some people never get to bed at a reasonable hour?" So familiar was he with the process of putting up his own car that he awaited each step like an able executioner condemned to his own rack. The car insultingly cheerful in the driveway. The car door opened and banged shut. Then garage door slid open, grating on the sill, and the car door again. The motor raced for the climb up into the garage, and raced once more, explosively, before it was shut off. A final opening and slamming of the car door. Silence, then a horrible silence, filled with waiting, till the leisurely Mr. Doppelbrau had examined the state of his tires, and had at last shut the garage door. Instantly, for Babbitt, a blessed state of oblivion. 4. At that moment, in the city of Zenith, Horace Updike was making love to Lucille McKelvey in their mauve drawing-room on Royal Ridge. After the return from a lecture by the eminent English novelist, Updike was Zenith's professional bachelor, a slim-waisted man of 46, with an effeminate voice in taste in flowers, cretones, and flappers. Mrs. McKelvey was red-haired, creamy, discontented, exquisite, rude, and honest. Updike tried his invariable first maneuver, touching her nervous wrist. "Don't be an idiot," she said. "Do you mind awfully?" "No. That's what I mind." He changed to conversation. He was famous at conversation. He spoke reasonably of psychoanalysis, Long Island polo, and the Ming platter he had found in Vancouver. She promised to meet him in Deauville the coming summer, though she sighed, "It's becoming too dreadfully banal. Nothing but Americans and frowsy English baronesses." And at that moment in Zenith, a cocaine runner and a prostitute were drinking cocktails in Healey Hanson's saloon on Front Street. Since national prohibition was now in force, and since Zenith was notoriously law-abiding, they were compelled to keep cocktails innocent by drinking them out of teacups. The lady threw her cup at the cocaine runner's head. He worked his revolver out of the pocket in his sleeve and casually murdered her. At that moment in Zenith, two men sat in a laboratory. For 37 hours now they had been working on a report of their investigations of synthetic rubber. At that moment in Zenith there was a conference of 4 union officials as to whether the 12,000 coal miners within 100 miles of the city should strike. Of these men, one resembled a testy and prosperous grocer, one a Yankee carpenter, one a soda jerk, and one a Russian Jewish actor. The Russian Jew quoted Kautsky, Gene Debs, and Abraham Lincoln. At that moment a GAR veteran was dying. He had come from the Civil War straight to a farm, which, though it was officially within the city limits of Zenith, was primitive as the backwoods. He had never ridden in a motor car, never seen a bathtub, never read any book save the Bible, McGuffey's Readers, and religious tracts, and he believed that the earth is flat, that the English are the lost 10 tribes of Israel, and that the United States is a democracy. At that moment the steel and cement town which composed the factory of the Pullmore Tractor Company of Zenith was running on night shift to fill an order of tractors for the Polish army. It hummed like a million bees, glared through its wide windows like a volcano. Along the high wire fences searchlights played on the cinder-lined yard, switch-tracks and armed guards on patrol. At that moment Mike Monday was finishing a meeting. Mr. Monday, the distinguished evangelist, the best-known Protestant pontiff in America, had once been a prize-fighter. Satan had not dealt justly with him. As a prize-fighter he gained nothing but his crooked nose, his celebrated vocabulary, and his stage presence. The service of the Lord had been more profitable. He was about to retire with a fortune. It had been well earned, for, to quote his last report, Reverend Mr. Monday, the prophet with a punch, has shown that he is the world's greatest salesman of salvation, and that by efficient organization the overhead of spiritual regeneration may be kept down to an unprecedented rock-bottom basis. He has converted over 200,000 lost and priceless souls at an average cost of less than $10 a head. Of the larger cities of the land, only Zenith had hesitated to submit its vices to Mike Monday and his expert reclamation corps. The more enterprising organizations of the city had voted to invite him. Mr. George F. Babbitt had once praised him in a speech at the Boosters' Club. But there was opposition from certain Episcopalian and Congregationalist ministers, those renegades whom Mr. Monday so finely called a bunch of gospel pushers with dishwater instead of blood, a gang of squealers that need more dust on their knees of their pants and more hair on their skinny old chests. This opposition had been crushed when the Secretary of the Chamber of Commerce had reported to a committee of manufacturers that in every city he had appeared Mr. Monday had turned the minds of workmen from wages and hours to higher things, and thus averted strikes. He was immediately invited. An expense fund of $40,000 had been underwritten. Out on the county fairgrounds a Mike Monday tabernacle had been erected, to seat 15,000 people. In it the prophet was at this moment concluding his message. There are a lot of smart college professors and tea-guzzling slobs in this burg that say I'm a roughneck and a never-wasser, and my knowledge of history is not yet. Oh, there's a gang of woolly-whiskered book-lice that think they know more than Almighty God and prefer a lot of Hun science and smutty German criticism to the straight and simple Word of God. Oh, there's a swell bunch of Lizzie boys and lemon-suckers and pie-faces and infidels and beer-bloated scribblers that love to fire off their filthy mouths and yip that Mike Monday is vulgar and full of mush. Those pups are saying now that I hog the gospel show, that I'm in it for the coin. Well, now listen, folks. I'm going to give those birds a chance. They can stand up here and tell me to my face that I'm a galoot and a liar and a hick. Only if they do, don't faint with surprise if some of them who's rum-dum liars get one good swift poke from Mike, with all the kick of God's flaming righteousness behind the wallop. Well, come on, folks. Who says it? Who says Mike Monday is a four-flush and a yahoo? Huh? I didn't see anybody standing up. Well, there you are. Now I guess the folks in this town will quit listening to all the coo-yachting from behind the fence. I guess you'll quit listening to the guys that pan and roast and kick and beef and vomit out filthy atheism, and all of you'll come in with every grain of pep and reverence you got, and boost all together for Jesus Christ and His everlasting mercy and tenderness. At that moment Seneca Doane, the radical lawyer, and Dr. Kurt Yakovich, the histologist, whose report on the destruction of epithelial cells under radium had made the name of Zenith known in Munich, Prague, and Rome, were talking in Doane's library. Zenith's a city with gigantic power, gigantic buildings, gigantic machines, gigantic transportation, meditated Doane. I hate your city. It has standardized all the beauty out of life. It is one big railroad station with all the people taking tickets for the best cemeteries, Dr. Yavitch said placidly. Doane roused. I'm hanged if it is. You make me sick, Kurt, with your perpetual whine about standardization. Don't you suppose any other nation is standardized? Is anything more standardized than England, with every house that can afford it having the same muffins at the same tea hour, and every retired general going to exactly the same evensong at the same gray stone church with a square tower, and every golfing prig in Harris tweed saying, "Right you are," to every other prosperous ass? Yet I love England. And for standardization, look at the sidewalk cafes in France and the love-making in Italy. Standardization is excellent per se. When I buy an Ingersoll watch or a Ford, I get a better tool for less money, and I know precisely what I'm getting, and that leaves me more time and energy to be individual in. And I remember once in London I saw a picture of an American suburb in a toothpaste ad on the back of the Saturday Evening Post, an elm-lined, snowy street of these new houses, Georgian some of them, or with low, raking roofs, the kind of street you'd find here in Zenith, say in Floral Heights, open trees, grass, and I was homesick. There's no other country in the world that has such pleasant homes, and I don't care if they are standardized. It's a corking standard. No, what I fight in Zenith is standardization of thought, and, of course, the traditions of competition. The real villains of the piece are the clean, kind, industrious family men who use every known brand of trickery and cruelty to ensure the prosperity of their cubs. The worst thing about these fellows is that they're so good, and their work, at least, so intelligent. You can't hate them properly, and yet their standardized minds are the enemy. Then this boasting sneakingly, I have a notion that Zenith is a better place to live in than Manchester or Glasgow or Lyons or Berlin or Turin. It is not, and I have lived in most of them, demurred Dr. Yavitch. Well, matter of taste. Personally, I prefer a city with a future so unknown that it excites my imagination. But what I particularly want... You, said Dr. Yavitch, are a middle-road liberal, and you haven't the slightest idea of what you want. I, being a revolutionist, know exactly what I want, and what I want now is a drink." 6. At that moment in Zenith, Jake Offutt, the politician, and Henry T. Thompson were in conference. Offutt suggested, "The thing to do is get your fool son-in-law Babbitt to put it over. He's one of those patriotic guys. When he grabs a piece of property for the gang, he makes it look like we were dying of love for the dear peepful. And I do love to buy respectability. Reasonable. Wonder how long we can keep it up, Hank? We're safe as long as the good little boys like Georgie Babbitt and all the nice respectable labor leaders think you and me are rugged patriots. There's swell picking for an honest politician here, Hank. A whole city working to provide cigars and fried chickens and dried martinis for us, and rallying to our banner with indignation, oh, fierce indignation, whenever some squealer like this fellow Seneca Doane comes along. Honest, Hank, a smart codger like me ought to be ashamed of himself if he didn't milk cattle like them when they come around mooing for it. But the Traction gang can't get away with grand larceny like it used to. I wonder when, Hank. I wish we could fix some way to run this fellow Seneca Doane out of town. It's him or us." At that moment in Zenith, 340 or 50,000 ordinary people were asleep, a vast unpenetrated shadow. In the slum beyond the railroad track, a young man who for 6 months had sought work turned on the gas and killed himself and his wife. At that moment Lloyd Mallam, the poet, owner of the Haffett's bookshop, was finishing a rondeau to show how diverting was life amid the feuds of medieval Florence, but how dull it was in so obvious a place as Zenith. And at that moment George F. Babbitt turned ponderously in bed, the last turn, signifying that he'd had enough of this worried business of falling asleep, and was about it in earnest. Instantly he was in the magic dream. He was somewhere among unknown people who laughed at him. He slipped away, ran down the paths of a midnight garden, and at the gate the fairy child was waiting. Her dear and tranquil hand caressed his cheek. He was gallant and wise and well beloved. Warm ivory were her arms, and beyond perilous moors the brave sea glittered. End of Chapter 7. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 8. The great events of Babbitt's spring were the secret buying of real estate options in Linton for certain street traction officials before the public announcement that the Linton Avenue car line would be expanded, and a dinner which was, as he rejoiced to his wife, not only a regular society spread, but a real sure-enough highbrow affair, with some of the keenest intellects and the brightest bunch of little women in town. It was so absorbing an occasion that he almost forgot his desire to run off to Maine with Paul Riesling, though he had been born in the village of Catawba. Babbitt had risen to that metropolitan social plane on which hosts have as many as 4 people at dinner without planning it for more than an evening or two. But a dinner for 12, with flowers from the florist and all the cut glass out, staggered even the Babbitts. For 2 weeks they studied, debated, and arbitrated the list of guests. Babbitt marveled. "Of course we're up to date ourselves, but still, think of us entertaining a famous poet like Chum Frink, a fellow that on nothing but a poem or so every day and just writing a few advertisements pulls down 15,000 berries a year." "Yes, and Howard Littlefield. Do you know the other evening Eunice told me her papa speaks 3 languages," said Mrs. Babbitt. That's nothing. So do I. American baseball and poker." "I don't think it's nice to be funny about a matter like that. Think how wonderful it must be to speak 3 languages, and so useful, and with people like that. I don't see why we invite the Orville Joneses."
"Well, now, Orville is a mighty up-and-comin' fellow."
"Yes, I know, but a laundry—"
"I'll admit a laundry hasn't got the class of poetry or real estate, but just the same, Orvy is mighty deep. Ever start him spieling about gardening? Say, that fellow can tell you the name of every kind of tree, and some of their Greek and Latin names, too. Besides, we owe the Joneses a dinner. Besides, gosh, we got to have some boob for audience when a bunch of hot air artists like Frink and Littlefield get going."
"Well, dear, I meant to speak of this. I do think that as a host you ought to sit back and listen, and let your guests have a chance to talk once in a while."
"Oh, you do you? Sure, I talk all the time, and I'm just a business man. Oh, sure, I'm no Ph.D. like Littlefield, and no poet, and I haven't anything to spring. Well, let me tell you, just the other day your darn chum Frink comes up to me at the club begging to know what I thought about the Springfield School bond issue. And who told him? I did. You bet your life I told him. Little me, I certainly did. He came up and asked me, and I told him all about it. You bet. And he was darn glad to listen to me. Duty as a host. I guess I know my duty as a host, and let me tell you."
In fact, the Orville Joneses were invited. 2. On the morning of the dinner, Mrs. Babbitt was restive. "Now, George, I want you to be sure and be home early tonight. Remember, you have to dress."
I see by the Advocate that the Presbyterian General Assembly has voted to quit the interchurch world movement. That—"
"George, did you hear what I said? You must be home in time to dress tonight."
"Dress, hell! I'm dressed now. Think I'm going down to the office in my BVDs?"
"I will not have you talking indecently before the children. And you do have to put on your dinner jacket."
"I guess you mean my tux. I'll tell you, of all the doggone nonsensical nuisances that was ever invented."
3 minutes later, after Babbitt had wailed,
"Well, I don't know whether I'm going to dress or not,"
in a manner which showed that he was going to dress, the discussion moved on. "Now, George, you mustn't forget to call at Vecchia's on the way home and get ice cream. Their delivery wagon is broken down, and I don't want to trust them to send it by—"
"All right. You told me that before breakfast."
"Well, I don't want you to forget. I'll be working my head off all day long training the girl that's to help with the dinner."
"Oh, nonsense anyway, hiring an extra girl for the feed. Matilda could perfectly well—"
"And I have to go out and buy flowers and fix them and set the table and order the salted almonds and look at the chickens and arrange the children to have their supper upstairs, and I simply must depend on you to go to Vecchia's for ice cream."
"All right. Gosh, I'm going to get it."
"All you have to do is go in and say you want the ice cream that Mrs. Babbitt ordered yesterday by phone, and it will be all ready for you." At 10:30 she telephoned him not to forget the ice cream from Vecchia's. He was surprised and blasted then by a thought. He wondered whether Floral Heights dinners were worth the hideous toil involved. But he reprinted the sacrilege in the excitement of buying the materials for cocktails. Now this was the manner of obtaining alcohol under the reign of righteousness and prohibition. He drove from the severe rectangular streets of the modern business center into the tangled byways of Old Town, jagged blocks filled with sooty warehouses and lofts, on into the Arbor, once a pleasant orchard, but now a morass of lodging-houses, tenements, and brothels. Exquisite shivers chilled up his spine and stomach, and he looked at every policeman with intense innocence, as one who loved the law and admired the force, and longed to stop and play with them. He parked his car a block from the Healey Hanson saloon, worrying,
"Well, rats, if anybody did see me, they'd think I was out here on business."
He entered a place curiously like the saloons of anti-prohibition days, with a long, greasy bar with sawdust in front and streaky mirror behind, a pine table at which a dirty old man dreamed over a glass of something which resembled whiskey, and with 2 men at the bar drinking something which resembled beer, and giving that impression of forming a large crowd which 2 men always give in a saloon. The bartender, a tall, pale Swede with a diamond in his lilac scarf, stared at Babbitt as he stalked plumply up to the bar and whispered,
"I'd friend of Hanson's sent me here. Like to get some gin?"
The bartender gazed down on him in the manner of an outraged bishop. "I guess you've got the wrong place, my friend. We sell nothing but soft drinks here." He cleaned the bar with a rag which would itself have done with a little cleaning, and glared across his mechanically moving elbow. The old dreamer at the table petitioned the bartender.
"Say, Oscar, listen."
Oscar did not listen.
Say, Oscar, listen, will you? Say, listen."
The decayed and drowsy voice of the loafer, the agreeable stink of beer dregs, threw a spell of initiation over Babbitt. The bartender moved grimly toward the crowd of two men. Babbitt followed him as delicately as a cat, and wheedled,
"Say, Oscar, I want to speak to Mr. Hanson."
"What you want to see him for?"
"I just want to talk to him. Here's my card."
It was a beautiful card, an engraved card, a card in the blackest black and the sharpest red, announcing that Mr. George F. Babbitt was estates, insurance, rents. The bartender held it as though it weighed 10 pounds, and read it as though it were 100 words long. He did not bend from his episcopal dignity, but he growled,
"I'll see if he's around."
From the back room he brought an immensely old young man, a quiet, sharp-eyed man in tan silk shirt, checkered vest hanging open, and burning brown trousers. Mr. Healey Hanson. Mr. Hanson said only, "Yeah?" But his implacable and contemptuous eyes queried Babbitt's soul, and he seemed not at all impressed by the new dark gray suit for which, as he had admitted to every acquaintance at the Athletic Club, Babbitt had paid $125.
"Glad to meet you, Mr. Hanson. Say, I'm George Babbitt of the Babbitt Thompson Realty Company. I'm a great friend of Jake Offutt's."
"What of it?"
"Say, I'm going to have a party, and Jake told me you'd be able to fix me up with a little gin."
In alarm, in obsequiousness, as Hanson's eyes grew more bored,
"You telephone to Jake about me if you want to."
Hanson answered by jerking his head to indicate the entrance to the back room, and strolled away. Babbitt, melodramatically, crept into an apartment containing 4 round tables, 11 chairs, a brewery calendar, and a smell. He waited. Thrice he saw Healey Hanson saunter through, humming, hands in pockets, ignoring him. By this time Babbitt had modified his valiant morning vow.
"I won't pay 1 cent over $7 a quart,"
to
"I might pay 10.
On Hanson's next weary entrance he besought,
"Could you fix that up?"
Hanson scowled and grated, "Just a minute, Pete's sake, just a minute." In growing meekness Babbitt went on waiting till Hanson casually reappeared with a quart of gin, what is euphemistically known as a quart, in his disdainful long white hands. $12, he snapped.
Captain Jake thought you'd be able to fix me up for 8 or 9 a bottle."
"Nope, 12. This is the real stuff, smuggled from Canada. This is none of your natural spirits with a drop of juniper extract." The honest merchant said virtuously, 12 bones if you want it. Of course, you understand. I'm just doing this anyway as a friend of Jake's."
Sure, I understand."
Babbitt gratefully held out $12. He felt honored by contact with greatness as Hanson yawned, stuffed the bills uncounted into his radiant vest, and swaggered away. He had a number of titillations out of concealing the gin bottle under his coat, and out of hiding it in his desk. All afternoon he snorted and chuckled and gurgled over his ability to
"give the boys a real shot in the arm tonight."
He was, in fact, so exhilarated that he was within a block of his house before he remembered that there was a certain matter, mentioned by his wife, of fetching ice cream from Vecchia's. He explained,
"Oh, darn it,"
and drove back. Vecchia was not a caterer. He was the caterer of Zenith. Most coming-out parties were held in the white and gold ballroom of the Maison Vecchia. At all nice teas the guest recognized the 5 kinds of Vecchia sandwiches, and the 7 kinds of Vecchia cakes. And all really smart dinners ended, as on a resolving chord, Vecchia Neapolitan ice cream in one of the 3 reliable molds: the melon mold, the round mold like a layer cake, and the long brick. Vecchia's shop had pale blue woodwork, tracery of plaster roses, attendants in frilled aprons, and glass shelves of kisses, with all the refinement that inheres in whites of eggs. Babbitt felt heavy, thick, amid this professional daintiness, and as he waited for the ice cream, he decided, with hot prickles at the back of his neck, that a girl customer was giggling at him. He went home in a touchy temper. The first thing he heard was his wife's agitated, "George, did you remember to go to Vecchia's and get ice cream?"
Say, look here, do I ever forget to do things?
"Yes, often."
Well, now, it's darn seldom I do, and it certainly makes me tired after going into a pink tea joint like Vecchia's, and having to stand around looking at a lot of half-naked young girls, all rouged up like they were 60 and eating a lot of stuff that simply ruins their stomachs.
"Oh, it's too bad about you. I have noticed how you hate to look at pretty girls." With a jar, Babbitt realized that his wife was too busy to be impressed by that moral indignation with which males rule the world, and he went humbly upstairs to dress. He had an impression of a glorified dining-room, of cut glass, candles, polished wood, lace, silver, roses, with the awed swelling of the heart suitable to so grave a business as giving a dinner. He slew the temptation to wear his plaited dress shirt for the fourth time, took out an entirely fresh one, tightened his black bow, and rubbed his patent leather pumps with a handkerchief. He glanced with pleasure at his garnet and silver studs. He smoothed and patted his ankles, transformed by silk socks from the sturdy shanks of George Babbitt to the elegant limbs of what is called a clubman. He stood before the pier glass, viewing his trim dinner coat, his beautiful triple-braided trousers, and murmured in lyric beatitude, "By golly, I don't look bad. I certainly don't look like Catawba. If the Hicks back home could see me in this rig, they'd have a fit." He moved majestically down to mix the cocktails. As he chipped ice, as he squeezed oranges, as he collected vast stores of bottles, glasses, and spoons at the sink and in the pantry, he felt as authoritative as the bartender at Healey Hanson's saloon. True, Mrs. Babbitt said he was underfoot, and Matilda and the maid hired for the evening brushed by him, elbowed him, shrieked, "Please open the door," as they trotted through with trays. But in his high moment he ignored them. Besides the new bottle of gin, his cellar consisted of 1/2 bottle of bourbon whiskey, a quarter of a bottle of Italian vermouth, and approximately 100 drops of orange bitters. He did not possess a cocktail shaker. A shaker was proof of dissipation, the symbol of a drinker, and Babbitt disliked being known as a drinker, even more than he liked to drink. He mixed by pouring from an ancient gravy boat into a handleless pitcher. He poured with noble dignity, holding his alembics high beneath the powerful Mazda globe, his face hot, his shirt front a glaring white, the copper sink a scoured red gold. He tasted the sacred essence.
Now, by golly, if that isn't pretty near one fine old cocktail. Kind of a Bronx and yet like a Manhattan. Hey, Myra, want a little nip before the folks come?"
Bustling into the dining-room, moving each glass a quarter of an inch, rushing back with resolution implacable on her face, her gray and silver lace party frock protected by a denim towel, Mrs. Babbitt glared at him and rebuked him. "Certainly not."
"Well,"
in a loose, jocose manner,
"I think the old man will."
The cocktail filled him with a whirling exhilaration beyond which he was aware of devastating desires. To rush places in fast motors, to kiss girls, to sing, to be witty. He sought to regain his lost dignity by announcing to Matilda,
"I'm going to stick this pitcher of cocktails in the refrigerator. Be sure you don't upset any of 'em." "Yeah. Well, be sure now. Don't go putting anything on the top shelf." "Yeah. Well,
He was dizzy. His voice was thin and distant. With enormous impressiveness he commanded,
"Well, be sure now,"
and minced into the safety of the living-room. He wondered whether he could persuade
"as slow as bunch as Myra and the Littlefields to go some place to have dinner and raise Cain and maybe dig up some more booze."
He perceived that he had gifts of profligacy which had been neglected. By the time the guests had come, including the inevitable late couple for whom the others waited with painful immovability, a great gray emptiness had replaced the purple swirling in Babbitt's head, and he had to force the tumultuous greetings suitable to a host on Floral Heights. The guests were Howard Littlefield, the doctor of philosophy who furnished publicity and comforting economics to the Street Traction Company; Vergil Gunch, the coal dealer, equally powerful in the Elk and in the Boosters' Club; Eddie Swanson, the agent for the Javelin Motor Car, who lived across the street; and Orville Jones, owner of the Lily White Laundry, which justly announced itself the biggest, busiest, bulliest cleaneries shop in Zenith. But naturally the most distinguished of all was T. Cholmondeley Frink, who was not only the author of Polydamas, which, syndicated daily in 67 leading newspapers, gave him one of the largest audiences of any poet in the world, but also an optimistic lecturer and the creator of Ads That Add. Despite the searching philosophy and high morality of his verses, they were humorous and easily understood by any child of 12, and it added a neat air of pleasantry to them that they were set not as verse but as prose. Mr. Frink was known from coast to coast as Chum. With them were 6 wives, more or less. It was hard to tell, so early in the evening, as at first glance they all looked alike, and as they all said, "Oh, isn't this nice?" in the same tone of determined liveliness. To the eye the men were less similar. Littlefield, a hedge scholar, tall and horse-faced; Chum Frink, a trifle of a man, with soft and mouse-like hair, advertising his profession as poet by a silk cord on his eye-glasses; Vergil Gunch, broad, with coarse black hair, embrossed; Eddie Swanson, a bald and bouncing young man who showed his taste for elegance by an evening waistcoat of figured black silk with glass buttons; Orville Jones, a steady-looking, stubby, not very memorable person, with a hemp-colored toothbrush mustache. Yet they were all so well fed and clean, they all shouted "Evening, Georgie," with such robustness that they seemed to be cousins. And the strange thing is that the longer one knew the women, the less alike they seemed, while the longer one knew the men, the more alike their bold patterns appeared. The drinking of the cocktails was as canonical a rite as the mixing. The company waited uneasily, hopefully, agreeing in a strained manner that the weather had been rather warm and slightly cold, but still Babbitt said nothing about drinks. They became despondent. But when the late couple, the Swansons, had arrived, Babbitt hinted, "Well, folks, you think we could stand breaking the law a little?" They looked at Chum Frink, the recognized lord of language. Frink pulled at his eyeglass cord as if a bell-rope. He cleared his throat and said that which was the custom. "I'll tell you, George, I'm a law-abiding man, but they do say Verg Gunch is a regular yegg, and of course he's bigger'n I am, and I just can't figure out what I'd do if he tried to force me into anything criminal." Gunch was roaring, "Well, I'll take a chance," when Frink held up his hand and went on, "So if Verg and you insist, Georgie, I'll park my car on the wrong side of the street, because I take it for granted that's the crime you're hinting at." There was a great deal of laughter. Mrs. Jones asserted, "Mr. Frink is simply too killing. You'd think he was so innocent." Babbitt clamored, "How did you guess it, Chum? Well, you all just wait a moment while I go out and get the keys to your cars." Through a froth of merriment he brought the shining promise, the mighty tray of glasses with the cloudy yellow cocktails in the glass pitcher in the center. The men babbled, "Oh, gosh, have a look," and "This gets me right where I live," and "Let me at it." But Chum Frink, a traveled man and not unused to woes, was stricken by the thought that the potion might be merely fruit juice, with a little natural spirits. He looked timid as Babbitt, a moist and ecstatic almoner, held out a glass. But as he tasted it, he plied, "Oh, man, let me dream on. It ain't true, but don't waken me. Just let me slumber." 2 hours before, Frink had completed a newspaper lyric beginning, I sat alone and groused and thunk, and scratched my head and sighed and wunk, and groaned. There are still black who like the old-time gin-mill back, that den that makes the sage a loon, the vile and smelly old saloon. I'll never miss her poison booze, whilst the bubbling spring I can use, that leaves my head at merry morn as clear as any babe new-born. Babbitt drank with the others. His moment's depression was gone. He perceived that these were the best fellows in the world. He wanted to give them 1,000 cocktails.
"Think you can stand another?"
he cried. The wives refused with giggles, but the men, speaking in a wide, elaborate, enjoyable manner, gloated, "Well, sooner than have you get sore at me, Georgie."
"You got a little dividend coming," said Babbitt to each of them, and each in tone, "Squeeze it, Georgie, squeeze it."
When beyond hope the pitcher was empty, they stood and talked about prohibition. The men leaned back on their heels, put their hands in their trousers pockets, and proclaimed their views with the booming profundity of a prosperous male repeating a thoroughly hackneyed statement about a matter of which he knows nothing whatever.
"Now, I'll tell you," said Vergil Gunch. "Way I figure it is this, and I can speak by the book because I've talked to a lot of doctors and fellows that ought to know, and the way I see it is that it's a good thing to get rid of the saloon, but they ought to let a fellow have beer and light wines."
Howard Littlefield observed, "What isn't generally recognized is that it's a dangerous proposition to invade the rights of personal liberty. Now, take this for instance. The King of Bavaria, I think it was Bavaria? Yes, Bavaria it was, in 1862, March 1862. He issued a proclamation against public grazing of livestock. The peasantry had stood for overtaxation without the slightest complaint, but when this proclamation came out they rebelled. Or it may have been Saxony, but it just goes to show the dangers of invading the rights of personal liberty." "That's it. No one got a right to invade personal liberty," said Orville Jones.
"Just the same, you don't want to forget prohibition is a mighty good thing for the working class. Keeps them from wasting their money and lowering their productiveness," said Vergil Gunch.
"Yes, that's so, but the trouble is the manner of enforcement," insisted Howard Littlefield. "Congress didn't understand the right system. Now, if I'd been running the thing, I'd have arranged it so the drinker himself was licensed, and then we could have taken care of the shiftless workman, keep him from drinking, and yet not have interfered with the rights, with the personal liberty of fellows like ourselves." They bobbed their heads, looked admiringly at one another, and stated, "That's so. That wouldn't be a stunt." "Thing that worries me is a lot of these guys will take to cocaine," sighed Eddie Swanson. They bobbed more violently and groaned, "That's so. There is danger of that." Chum Frink chanted, "Oh, say, I got hold of a swell new recipe for homemade beer the other day. You take—" Gunch interrupted, "Wait, let me tell you mine." Littlefield snorted, "Beer rats! Things to do to ferment cider." Jones insisted, "I've got the recipe that does the business." Swanson begged, "Oh, say, let me tell you the story." But Frink went on resolutely, "You take and save the shells from peas, and pour 6 gallons of water on a bushel of shells, and boil the mixture till—" Mrs. Babbitt turned them with yearning sweetness. Frank hastened to finish even his best beer recipe, and she said gaily, "Dinner is served." There was a good deal of friendly argument among the men as to which should go in last, and while they were crossing the hall from the living-room to the dining-room, Vergil Gunch made them laugh by thundering, "If I can't sit next to Myra Babbitt and hold her hand at the table, I won't play. I'm going home." In the dining-room they stood embarrassed, while Mrs. Babbitt fluttered, "Now let me see. Oh, I was going to have some nice hand-painted place cards for you, but let me see. Mr. Frink, would you sit here?" The dinner was in the best style of women's magazine art, whereby the salad was served in hollowed apples, and everything but the invincible fried chicken resembled something else. Ordinarily the men found it hard to talk to the women. Flirtation was an art unknown on Floral Heights, and the realms of offices and of kitchens had no alliances. But under the inspiration of cocktails, conversation was violent. Each of the men still had a number of important things to say about prohibition, and now that each had a loyal listener in his dinner partner, he burst out, "I want a place where I can get all the hooch I want at 8 a quart. Did you read about this fellow that went and paid $1,000 for 10 cases of red-eye that proved to be nothing but water? Seems the fellow was standing on the corner, and the fellow comes up to him. They say there's a whole raft of stuff being smuggled across at Detroit. What I always say is, what a lot of folks don't realize about prohibition, and then when you get all this awful poison stuff, wood alcohol and everything. Of course, I believe in it on principle, but I don't propose to have anybody tell me what I got to think and do. No American will ever stand for that." But they all felt that it was rather in bad taste for Orville Jones, and he not recognized as one of the wits of the occasion anyway, to say, "In fact, the whole thing about prohibition is this: it isn't the initial cost, it's the humidity." Not till the one required topic had been dealt with did the conversation become general. It was often, and admittedly, said of Vergil Gunch, "Gee, that fellow can get away with murder. Why, he can pull a raw one in mixed company, and all the ladies'll laugh their heads off. But me, gosh, if I crack anything that's just the least bit off color, I get razzed for fair." Now Gunch delighted them by crying to Mrs. Eddie Swanson, youngest of the women, "Louetta, I managed to pinch Eddie Dorky out of his pocket. And what say you we sneak across the street when the folks aren't looking? Got something?" with a gorgeous leer. "Awful important to tell you." The women wriggled, and Babbitt was stirred to like naughtiness. "Say, folks, I wish I'd dared to show you a book I borrowed from Doc Pattern." "Now, George, the idea!" Mrs. Babbitt warned him. "This book, racy isn't the word. It's some kind of anthropological report about customs in the South Seas. And what it doesn't say, it's a book you can't buy. Verge, I'll lend it to you." "Me first," insisted Eddie Swanson. "Sounds spicy." Orville Jones announced, "Say, I heard a good one the other day about a couple of Swedes and their wives." And in the best Jewish accent he resolutely carried the good one to a slightly disinfected ending. Gunch capped it, but the cocktails waned, the seekers dropped back into cautious reality. Chum Frink had recently been on a lecture tour among the small towns, and he chuckled, "Awful good to get back to civilization. I certainly been seeing some hick towns. I mean, of course the folks there are the best on earth, but gee whiz, those Main Street burgs are slow. And you fellows can't hardly appreciate what it means to be here with a bunch of live ones." "You bet," exulted Orville Jones. "They're the best folks on earth, those small town folks. But, oh, mama, what conversation! Why, say, they can't talk about anything but the weather and the Neo Ford. By Hackelman!" "That's right. They all talk just about the same things," said Eddie Swanson. "Don't they, though? They just say the same things over and over," said Vergil Gunch. "Yes, it's really remarkable. They seem to lack all power of looking at things impersonally. They simply go over and over the same talk about Fords and the weather and so on," said Howard Littlefield. "Still, at that, you can't blame 'em. They haven't got any intellectual stimulus such as you get up here in the city," said Chum Frink. "Gosh, that's right," said Babbitt. "I don't want you highbrows to get stuck on yourself, but I must say it keeps a fellow right up on his toes to sit with a poet and with Howard, the guy that put the con in economics. But these small-town boobs, with nobody but each other to talk to, no wonder they get so sloppy and uncultured in their speech and so balled up in their thinking." Orville Jones commented, "And then take our other advantages. The movies, for instance. Those Yapville sports think they're all get out if they have one change of bill a week, where here in the city you got your choice of a dozen different movies any evening you want to name." "Sure, the inspiration we get from rubbing up against high-class hustlers every day and getting jam full of ginger," said Eddie Swanson. "Same time," said Babbitt, "no sense excusing those Rube Bergs too easy. Fellow's own fault if he don't show the initiative to up and beat it to the city, like we did. And just speaking in confidence among friends,
They're jealous as a devil of a city man. Every time I go up to Catawba, I have to go around apologizing to the fellows I was brought up with because I've more or less succeeded and they haven't. And if you talk natural to 'em the way we do here, and show finesse and what you might call a broad point of view, why, they think you're putting on the side. There's my own half-brother Martin. Runs the little old general store my dad used to keep. Say, I'll bet he don't know there is such a thing as a tux, as a dinner jacket. If he was to come up here now, he'd think we were a bunch of why, gosh, I swear he wouldn't know what to think. Yes, sir, they're jealous."
Chum Frink agreed. "That's so, but what I mind is their lack of culture and appreciation of the beautiful. If you'll excuse me for being highbrow, now I like to give a high-class lecture and read some of my best poetry. Not the newspaper stuff, but the magazine things. But say, when I get in the tall grass, there's nothing will take but a lot of cheesy old stories and slang and junk that if any of us were to indulge in it here, he'd get the gate so fast it would make his head swim." Vergil Gunch summed up,
"Fact is, we're mighty lucky to be living among a bunch of city folks that recognize artistic things and business punch equally. We'd feel pretty glum if we got stuck in some Main Street burg and tried to wise up the old codgers to a kind of life we're used to here. But by golly, there's this you got to say for 'em. Every small American town is trying to get population and modern ideals, and darn if a lot of 'em don't put it across. Somebody starts planning a Rube Crossroads, telling how he was here in 1900 and it consisted of one muddy street, count 'em, one, and 900 human clams. Well, you go back there in 1920 and you find pavement and a swell little hotel and a first-class ladies' ready-to-wear shop. Real perfection, in fact. You don't want to just look at what these small towns are. You want to look at what they're aiming to become. And they all got an ambition that in the long run is going to make 'em the finest spots on earth. They all want to be just like Zenith." 3. However intimate they might be with T. Cholmondeley Chink as a neighbor, as a borrower of lawn-mowers and monkey-wrenches, they knew that he was also a famous poet and a distinguished advertising agent, that behind his easiness were sultry literary mysteries which they could not penetrate. But tonight, in the gin-evolved confidence, he admitted them to an arcanum. "I've got a literary problem that's worrying me to death. I'm doing a series of ads for the Zeeco car, and I want to make each of 'em a real little gem. Regular stylistic stuff. I'm all for this theory that perfection is the stunt, or nothing at all. And these are as tough things as I've tackled. You might think it'd be harder to do my poems, all these heart topics, home and fireside and happiness, but they're cinches. You can't go wrong on 'em. And you know what sentiments any decent go-ahead fellow must have if he plays the game, and you stick right to 'em. But the poetry of industrialism, now there's a literary line where you got to open up new territory. Do you know the fellow who's really the American genius? The fellow who you don't know his name, and I don't either, but his work ought to be preserved so future generations can judge our American thought and originality today. Why, the fellow that writes the Prince Albert tobacco ads. Just listen to this. It's P.A. that jams such joy in jimmy pipes. Say, bet you've often bent an ear to that spill of speech about hopping from 5 to 50 per by stepping on her a bit. Guess that's going some, all right, but just among ourselves, you'd better start a rapid whiz system to keep tabs as to how fast you'll buzz from low-smoke spirits to tip-top high. Once you line up behind a jiminy pipe, it's all aglow with such a peach of a pal, Prince Albert. Prince Albert is John on the job, always joyously more-ish in flavor, always delightfully cool and fragrant. For a fact, you never hooked such a double-decked, copper-riveted, two-fisted smoke enjoyment. Go to a pipe. Speedo quick like you light on a good thing. Why, packed with Prince Albert, you can play a joyously jimmy straight across the boards, and you know what that means. Now that, caroled motor agent Eddie Swenson, that's what I call he literature.
That Prince Albert fellow. Though, gosh, there can't be just one fellow that writes 'em. Must be a big board of classy ink slingers in conference. But anyway, now he doesn't write for long-haired pikers. He writes for regular guys. He writes for me, and I tip my beanie to him. The only thing is, I wonder if it sells the goods. Course, like these poets, this Prince Albert fellow lets his idea run away with him. It makes elegant reading, but it don't say nothing. I never go out and buy Prince Albert tobacco after reading it, because it doesn't tell me anything about the stuff. It's just a bunch of fluff. Frink faced him. "Oh, you're crazy. Have I got to sell you the idea of style? Anyway, that's the kind of stuff I'd like to do for the Zeeco, but I simply can't, so I decided to stick to the straight poetic, and I took a shot at a highbrow ad for the Zeeco. How do you like this? The long white trail is calling, calling, and it's over the hills and far away for every man or woman that has red blood in his veins, and on his lips the ancient song of the buccaneers. It's away with dull drudging, and a fig for care, speed, glorious speed. It's more than just a moment's exhilaration. It's life for you and me. This great new truth the makers of Zeeco car have considered as much as price and style. It's fleet as the antelope, smooth as the glide of a swallow, yet powerful as the charge of a bull elephant. Class breathes in every line. Listen, brother, you'll never know what the high art of hiking is till you try. Life's zipping a zest. The Zeeco." "Yes," Frink mused, "that's got an elegant color to it, if I do say so, but it ain't got the originality of Spill of Speech." The whole company sighed with sympathy and admiration. End of Chapter 8. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 9. 1. Babbitt was fond of his friends. He loved the importance of being host and shouting, "Certainly you're going to have some more chicken. The idea!" And he appreciated the genius of T. Cholmondeley Frink. But the vigor of the cocktails was gone, and the more he ate the less joyful he felt. Then the amity of the dinner was destroyed by the nagging of the Swansons. In Floral Heights and the other prosperous sections of Zenith, especially in the young married set, there were many women who had nothing to do. Though they had few servants, yet with gas stoves, electric ranges, and dishwashers, and vacuum cleaners, and tiled kitchen walls, their houses were so convenient that they had little housework, and much of their food came from bakeries and delicatessens. They had but 2, 1, or no children, and despite the myth that the Great War had made work respectable, their husbands objected to their wasting time and getting a lot of crank ideas in unpaid social work, and still more to their causing a rumor by earning money that they were not adequately supported. They worked perhaps 2 hours a day, and the rest of the time they ate chocolates, went to the motion pictures, went window shopping, went in gossiping 2s and 3s to card parties, read magazines, thought timorously of the lovers who never appeared, and accumulated a splendid restlessness, which they got rid of by nagging their husbands. The husbands nagged back. Of these naggers the Swansons were perfect specimens. Throughout the dinner Eddie Swanson had been complaining publicly about his wife's new frock. It was, he submitted, too short, too low, too immodestly thin, and much too expensive. He appealed to Babbitt. "Honest, George, what do you think of that rag Louetta went and bought? Don't you think it's the limit?"
"What's eating you, Eddie? I call it a swell little dress."
"Oh, it is, Mr. Swanson. It's a sweet frock," Mrs. Babbitt protested. "There now, do you see, Smarty? You're such an authority on clothes," Loretta raged, while the guests ruminated and peeped at her shoulders.
"It's all right now," said Swanson. "I'm authority enough so I know it was a waste of money, and it makes me tired to see you not wearing out a whole closet full of clothes you got already. I've expressed my idea about this before, and you know good and well you don't pay the least bit of attention. I have to camp on your trail to get you to do anything." There was much more of it, and they all assisted, but
Babbitt, everything about him was dim except his stomach, and that was a bright scarlet disturbance.
"Had too much grub. Oughtn't to eat all stuff,"
he groaned, while he went on eating, while he gulped down a chill and glutinous slice of ice cream brick and cocoanut cake as oozy as shaving cream. He felt as though he had been stuffed with clay. His body was bursting, his throat was bursting, his brain was hot mud, and only with agony did he continue to smile and shout as became a host of Floral Heights. He would, except for his guests, have fled outdoors and walked off the intoxication of food. But in the haze which filled the room they sat forever, talking, while he agonized.
"Darn fool to be eating all this. Not another mouthful."
And discovered that he was again tasting the sickly welter of melted ice cream on his plate. There was no magic in his friends. He was not uplifted when Howard Littlefield produced from his treasure house of scholarship the information that the chemical symbol for raw rubber is C10H16, which turns into isoprene, which is 2C5H8. Suddenly, without precedent, Babbitt was not merely bored, but admitting that he was bored. It was ecstasy to escape from the table, from the torture of a straight chair, and loll on the davenport in the living-room. The others, from their fitful, unconvincing talk, their expressions of being slowly and painfully smothered, seemed to be suffering from the toil of social life and the horror of good food as much as himself. All of them accepted with relief the suggestion of bridge. Babbitt recovered from the feeling of being boiled. He won at bridge. He was again able to endure Vergil Gunch's inexorable heartiness. But he pictured loafing with Paul Riesling beside a lake in Maine. It was as overpowering and imaginative as homesickness. He had never been to Maine, yet he beheld the shrouded mountains of the tranquil lake of evening.
"That boy Paul's worth all these ballyhoo and highbrows put together," he muttered. "And I'd like to get away from everything."
Even Louetta Swanson did not rouse him. Mrs. Swanson was pretty and plain. Babbitt was not an analyst of women, except as to their taste in furnished houses to rent. He divided them into real ladies, working women, old cranks, and fly chickens. He mooned over their charms, but he was of opinion that all of them, save the women of his own family, were different and mysterious. Yet he had known by instinct that Louetta Swanson could be approached. Her eyes and lips were moist, her face tapered from a broad forehead to a pointed chin, her mouth was thin but strong and avid, and between her brows were two out-curving and passionate wrinkles. She was 30, perhaps, or younger. Gossip had never touched her, but every man naturally and instantly rose to flirtatiousness when he spoke to her, and every woman watched her with stilled blankness. Between games, sitting on the davenport, Babbitt spoke to her with the requisite gallantry, that sonorous Floral Heights gallantry, which is not flirtation, but a terrified flight from it.
"You're looking like a soda fountain tonight, Louetta."
"Am I?"
"Old Eddie kind of on the rampage?"
"Yes, I get so sick of it."
"Well, when you get tired of hubby, you can run off with Uncle George."
"If I ran away, oh, well."
"Anybody ever tell you your hands are awful pretty?"
She looked down at them. She pulled the lace of her sleeves over them, but otherwise she did not heed him. She was lost in unexpressed imaginings. Babbitt was too languid this evening to pursue his duty of being a captivating, though strictly moral male. He ambled back to the bridge tables. He was not much thrilled when Mrs. Frink, a small, twittering woman, proposed that they try to do some spiritualism and table-tipping. "You know, Chum can make the spirits come. Honest, he just scares me." The ladies of the party had not emerged all evening, but now, as the sex given to things of the spirit while the men warred against base things material, they took command and cried, "Oh, let's—" In the dimness the men were rather solemn and foolish, but the good wives quivered and adored as they sat about the table. They laughed, "Now you be good, or I'll tell," when the men took their hands in the circle. Babbitt tingled with a slight return of interest in life as Louetta Swanson's hand closed on his with quiet firmness. all of them hunched over, intent. They startled as some one drew a strained breath. In the dusty light from the hall they looked unreal. They felt disembodied. Mrs. Gunch squeaked, and they jumped with unnatural jocularity, but at Frank's hiss they sank into subdued awe. Suddenly, incredibly, they heard a knocking. They stared at Frank's half-revealed hands and found them lying still. They wiggled and pretended not to be impressed. Frink spoke with gravity. "Is someone there?" A thud. "Is one knock to be the sign for yes?" A thud. "And two for no?" A thud. "Now, ladies and gentlemen, shall we ask the guide to put us into communication with the spirit of some great one passed over?" Frink mumbled. Mrs. Orville Jones begged, "Oh, let's talk to Dante. We studied him at the reading circle. You know who he was, Orvie?"
"Certainly I know who he was. The Wop poet. Where do you think I was raised?" From her insulted husband. "Sure, the fellow that took the Cook's tour to hell. I've never waded through his poetry, but we learned about him at the U," said Babbitt.
"Page, Mr. Dundee," intoned Eddie Swanson. "You ought to get him easy, Mr. Frink, you and he being fellow poets," said Louetta Swanson.
"Fellow poets, rats! Where'd you get that stuff?" protested Vergil Gunch. "I suppose Dante showed a lot of speed for an old-timer. Not that I've actually read him, of course, but to come right down to hard facts, he wouldn't stand a 1, 2, 3 if he had to buckle down to practical literature and turn out a poem for the newspaper syndicate every day like Chum does."
"That's so," from Eddie Swanson. "Those old birds could take their time. Judas Priest, I could write poetry myself if I had a whole year to do it, and just wrote about that old-fashioned junk like Dante wrote about."
Frink demanded, "Hush now, I'll call him." "Oh, laughing eyes, emerge forth from the ultimate, and bring hither the spirit of Dante, that we mortals may list to his words of wisdom."
"You forgot to give him the address, 1558 Brimstone Avenue, Fiery Heights, hell." Grinch chuckled, but the others felt that this was irreligious. And besides, probably it was just Chum making the knocks. But still, if there did happen to be something to all this, be exciting to talk to an old fellow belonging to way back in early years. A thud. The spirit of Dante had come to the parlor of George F. Babbitt. He was, it seemed, quite ready to answer their questions. He was glad to be with them this evening. Frink spelled out the messages by running through the alphabet till the spirit interpreter knocked at the right letter. Littlefield asked in a learned tone, "Do you like it in paradise, Monsieur?" "We are very happy on the higher plane, Signor. We are glad that you are studying this great truth of spiritualism," Dante replied. The circle moved with an odd creaking of stays and shirt-fronts. Suppose there were something to this. Babbitt had a different worry.
"Suppose Chum Frink was really one of those spiritualists. Chum had, for a literary fellow, always seemed to be a regular guy. He belonged to the Chatham Road Presbyterian Church, and went to the boosters' lunches, and liked cigars and motors and racy stories. But suppose that secretly, after all, you never could tell about these darn highbrows, and to be an out-and-out spiritualist would be almost like being a socialist."
No one could long be serious in the presence of Vergil Gunch.
"Ask Dante how Jack Shakespeare and old Verge,
the guy they named after me, are getting along, and don't they wish they could get into the movie game?" He blared, and instantly all was mirth. Mrs. Jones shrieked, and Eddie Swanson desired to know whether Dante didn't catch cold with nothing on but his wreath. The pleased Dante made humble answer. But Babbitt, the cursed discontent, was torturing him again, and heavily, in the impersonal darkness, he pondered.
"I don't. We're all so flip and think we're so smart. There'd be a fellow like Dante. I wish I'd read some of his pieces. I don't suppose I ever will now."
He had, without explanation, the impression of a slaggy cliff, and on it, in silhouette against menacing clouds, a lone and austere figure. He was dismayed by a sudden contempt for his surest friends. He grasped Louetta Swanson's hand and found the comfort of human warmth. Habit came, a veteran warrior, and he shook himself.
"What the deuce is the matter with me this evening?"
He patted Louetta's hand to indicate that he hadn't meant anything improper by squeezing it, and demanded of Frink,
See if you can get old Dante to spiel us some of his poetry. Talk up to him. Tell him, Buena gona, senor. Come ça va? We getst our little poem, senor.
2. The lights were switched on. The women sat on the front of their chairs in the determined suspense whereby a wife indicates that as soon as the present speaker was finished she is going to remark brightly to her husband, "Well, dear, I think perhaps it's about time for us to be saying good night." For once Babbitt did not break out in blustering efforts to keep the party going. There was something he wished to think out. But the physical research that started him off again,
Why don't they go home? Why didn't they go home?
Though he was impressed by the profundity of the statement, he was only half enthusiastic when Howard Littlefield lectured, "The United States is the only nation in which the government is a moral ideal and not just a social arrangement."
True, they weren't ever going home.
He was usually delighted to have an inside view of the momentous world of motors, but tonight he scarcely listened to Eddie Swanson's revelation, "If you want to go above the javelin class, the Zeeco is a mighty good buy. Couple of weeks ago, and mind you, this was a fair, square test, they took a Zeeco stock touring car, and they slid up the Town Sonata Hill on high, and fellow told me,
Zeeco's good boat, but were they planning to stay all night?"
They really were going, with a flutter of, we did have the best time." Most aggressively friendly of all was Babbitt. Yet as he burbled he was reflecting,
"I got through it, but for a time there I didn't hardly think I'd last out."
He prepared to taste the most delicate pleasure of the host, making fun of his guest in the relaxation of midnight. As the door closed he yawned voluptuously, chest out, shoulders wiggling, and turned cynically to his wife. She was beaming. "Oh, it was nice, wasn't it? I know they enjoyed every minute of it. Don't you think so?" He couldn't do it. He couldn't mock. It would have been like sneering at a happy child. He lied ponderously,
"You bet. Best party this year, by a long shot."
"Wasn't the dinner good? And honestly, I thought the fried chicken was delicious."
"You bet. Fried to the Queen's taste. Best chicken I've tasted for a coon's age."
"Didn't Matilda fry it beautifully? And don't you think the soup was simply delicious?"
"It certainly was. It was corking. Best soup I've tasted since Heck was a pup."
But his voice was seeping away. They stood in the hall under the electric light in its square box-like shade of red glass bound with nickel. She stared at him. "Why, George, you sound as if you hadn't really enjoyed it."
"Sure I did. Course I did."
"George, what is it?"
"Oh, I'm kind of tired, I guess. Been pounding pretty hard at the office. Need to get away and rest up a little."
"Well, we're going to Maine in just a few weeks now, dear."
"Yeah."
Then he was pouring it out nakedly, robbed of reticence.
"Myra, I think it'd be a good thing for me to get up there early."
"But you have this man you have to meet in New York about business."
"What man? Oh, sure, him. Oh, that's all off. But I want to hit Maine early. Get in a little fishing, catch me a big trout, by golly."
A nervous artificial laugh. "Well, why don't we do it? Verona and Matilda can run the house between them, and you and I can go any time if you think we can afford it."
"But I've been feeling so jumpy lately, I thought maybe it might be a good thing if I got kind of off by myself and sweated out me."
"George, don't you want me to go along?" She was too wretchedly in earnest to be tragic, or gloriously insulted, or anything save dumpy and defenseless and flushed to the red steaminess of a boiled beet.
Course I do. It just meant—"
Remembering that Paul Riesling had predicted this, he was as desperate as she.
"I mean, sometimes it's a good thing for an old grouch like me to go off and get it out of his system."
He tried to sound parental.
"Then when you and the kids arrive, I figured maybe I might skip up to Maine just a few days ahead of you. I'd be ready for a real bat. See how I mean?"
He coaxed her with large, booming sounds, with affable smiles, like a popular preacher blessing an Easter congregation, like a humorous lecturer compelling his stint of eloquence. Like all perpetrators of masculine wiles, she stared at him, the joy of festival drained from her face. "Do I bother you when we go on vacations? Do I add anything to your fun?" He broke. Suddenly, dreadfully, he was hysterical. He was a yelping baby.
"Yes, yes, hell yes! But can't you understand? I'm shot to pieces. I'm all in. I got to take care of myself. I got to. I'm sick of everything and everybody. I got to."
It was she who was mature and protective now. "Why, of course, you shall run off by yourself. Why don't you get Paul to go along, and you boys just fish and have a good time?" She patted his shoulder, reaching up to it, while he shook with palsied helplessness, and in that moment was not merely by habit fond of her, but clung to her strength. She cried cheerily, "Now upstairs you go, and pop into bed. We'll fix it all up. I'll see to the doors. Now skip." For many minutes, for many hours, for a bleak eternity, he lay awake, shivering, reduced to primitive terror, comprehending that he had won freedom, and wondering what he could do with anything so unknown and so embarrassing as freedom. Chapter 9.